Namaskar and welcome to Sunset Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of all key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the G7 summit. Now, the leaders of G7 grouping and its 5 partner countries, including India, have said that they seek to promote a rules-based international order, respect other states' territorial integrity and sovereignty, and vow to remain steadfast in their commitment to defending peace, human rights and the rule of law. In a joint statement after the summit meeting in Germany, G7 leaders affirmed their commitment to working towards equitable, inclusive and sustainable solutions to global challenges, which include climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Now, the G7 also pledged to raise $600 billion in private and public funds over 5 years to finance infrastructure in developing countries. This is quite significant. And then later on, addressing the session on climate, energy and health, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said access to energy should not be a privilege of the rich, and the poor also should have equal right to energy sources. In his remarks at another special session on food security and gender equality, Prime Minister Modi shared India's experiences and efforts in these areas and also suggested a list of focus areas that can help in ensuring food security. Today, we'll discuss and analyze various takeaways from this G7 summit and their implications as well. Also, how would that affect a lot of aspects in the global order? And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you. Beginning with, we have with us former Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, who is joining us. We also have with us Mr. Manoj Joshi. He is a distinguished fellow at ORF, and Professor Omu Salma Bawa is also joining us from the Center of European Studies at SIS in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome, all of you, to Sunset Television. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Singh, and let's first start by understanding a bit more about the significance of G7. It's not a formal international organization on a platform like several others which we have. But still, there seems to be a lot of importance attached to what is being decided and said at G7.
That is true, because the G7 were the world's biggest democracies other than India and the biggest economies. And they came together, discussed among themselves how the world should run. Particularly when the Cold War was ending, they became more relevant. But when the financial crisis came, they had to hastily seek the help of others and then form the G20. And the G7 has this love-hate relationship with Russia. For some time, they were a G8. Then they became a G7. And let's not forget that President Trump in 2020 for the summit, which didn't take place, actually wanted to invite Russia back as a guest. So the G7 is a conglomerate of countries which think they can run the world as they think it should be run.
Okay.
Now, the good thing is that they think India is a partner, which is very important for India, because Prime Minister Modi would attend the G7 summit right after attending the BRICS summit. So this is the ultimate diplomatic bridge which Indian foreign policy was aiming for, and this is what we succeeded in doing.
Okay. Okay. In fact, that's a very important aspect. And, if we continue on that thread, let me bring in Mr. Joshi here. Mr. Joshi, this aspect of India being a bridge, and that is quite evident also from the statement on Russia-Ukraine conflict, which came in from the G7, and Indian response to that as well.
Well, you know that the Indian position is well known. It has been well known even to the G7 countries. And I don't think there was any ambition that India is going to suddenly change its position. So I think there is an understanding when India is invited that India has a certain perspective of its own, and it's not just about to abandon it just like that. Mm-hmm. India has its own standing. It has its own clout. It has its own foreign policy perspective. And I think by now, it should be clear to all of them that India is not about to abandon that perspective in a hurry on this issue or that issue, and is going to remain firm on what it believes are best for its own national interests. And that is exactly how they run their foreign policy, meaning they see if this is the best for our national interest, they run that. So India is doing exactly the same.
Okay, indeed. Professor Bawa, as Ambassador Singh pointed out, in terms of the relevance and the importance and significance of what is said at G7 and how it is followed through. So, in your, summary, if we have to understand as to how far the G7 has fulfilled its purpose so long in this journey.
So, I mean, obviously, it's a well-established format now for dialogue, exchange, and trying to manage a kind of what I would say a group perspective on international challenge and crises. And every year as the G7 summit takes place, there is a certain agenda setting which takes place done by the leader, the country which is leading it. And of course, the backdrop becomes extremely important in terms of what would drive it. So if you look at it, the last three summits, COVID has been a very important factor, and now you've got the Ukraine war. One would have to read the output of the G7 summit in terms of the ability to pull together different kind of voices. Let's not forget that even if they're all the six most powerful economies and all democracies, it doesn't automatically lead to a normal interest convergence, but you will have to bring together a certain political understanding of how you look at the world and the current problem. And that's where then these statements become important. Point number two is, the ability to transform intention into action. And so there have been certain measures which have been put forward. One for global food security, for resilient democracies, for infrastructure investment. There's a global partnership. So between what they have stated as an intention, I think we would have to see in the coming months how this will translate into actually real-time, concrete projects and deliverables. So all of it will not immediately take place. I think that is important. But I think there is an attempt at a very strong political signaling. And as both Ambassador and Manoj have pointed out, I think India's presence in the last 3 years also tells us how important India is to the issue of global problems. And part of the solution, India has to be part of that. I think that is our important takeaway from an Indian perspective.
Okay. We'll come to that, important takeaway as well, Ambassador Singh, in terms of looking at it from Indian perspective. But let's first, go back to the global perspective and the present geopolitical situation. If you look at what is being said in the joint statement after the G7 summit, when, of course, they're talking about the rule-based international order, and then there's the $600 billion fund for the infrastructure in, developing countries as well. Perhaps, if I'm not wrong, then definitely targeted as at China's, Belt and Road initiative there, and several countries which are facing the economic brunt of that. That's one aspect. Then we look at, of course, as Mr. Joshi was referring to, that they have their own foreign policy agenda vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war. And one part of the statement was referring to that particular interest only, trying to, put up a united front against Russia.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I can't disagree with anything that you said. So let me try and elaborate. No, as Manoj pointed out, India's position on Ukraine is well known. Primary agenda of this G7 summit was to further isolate Russia and hopefully punish it for the aggression in Ukraine. That is why President Zelensky was asked to speak. But the significant part is that despite India being at variance on the issue of Ukraine, as Professor Bawa said, our contribution to solutions makes us an imperative person over there. So therefore, we were not left out because we had a different view on Ukraine. Secondly, the G7 is fully securitized now. Their first priority is Russia and how to bring everybody to NATO. So even Japan would be attending the NATO summit. So this overwhelming reach of the security aspects, unfortunate but happening. But in the other functional parts, India remains an important segment. Now you mentioned this program for
yes, the $600 billion fund, yes.
Structure, which President Biden says 600 billion, out of which 300 billion euros already EU has committed from its green fund. But at the last G7, They also announced a Build Back Better for similar reasons. So when will they start doing something rather than keep announcing new? At the moment, the new announcements outrun the number of projects that they're actually doing. So I think India needs to take the lead to translate these at least into some success stories. The other aspect was the Just Energy Transition Partnership. They started it with South Africa at the Conference of Parties in Glasgow. But since then, I think the European countries are learning how they need a just energy transition for their energy because they have to give up Russian energy and go back to coal. So I think today the pain understood better of how India and the other developing countries feel. So this just energy transition partnership will now be extended to India, Indonesia, Senegal, and Vietnam. That is significant. And the 10 billion euros that Chancellor Scholz promised Prime Minister Modi during the intergovernmental consultations in May, I think they were the first tranche and showed the confidence that India would be the major player when they try and do these transitions. And Prime Minister Modi said this in his address when he said every technology that you bring to India can be scaled up 5 to 10 times and become that much more relevant.
Okay. Manojji, when we're talking about the Indian perspective and when we are looking at it from our way, what India brings to the table is really, really important. And that has been highlighted by the Prime Minister umpteen number of times and in previous meetings as well. And in this summit also on the issues and important issues such as food security, gender equality, climate change, we are not only saying that we can do it, but we are saying that, yes, we are doing it and this is the better way to do it.
Well, I wouldn't be so arrogant to say that we think we know better how to do something. The fact of the matter is the technology is theirs, the money is theirs. Our real role would be to see how some of it could come here.
Okay.
Meaning our big goal has to be to attract some of that technology which can be developed to industrial scale here and trigger off a manufacturing revolution in India. But I do need to point out, that people talk of $600 billion. This is basically something which is to be mobilized. It is not as though the government, US government is putting down $600 billion and saying, here you are. What they are saying is that we will put up some money and then the private sector must put up some money. So this is very different from what the Belt and Road Initiative does, where big Chinese banks and the Belt and Road Fund have put out that cash. In this case, there is a question of mobilizing it. They say that we will, let's say, I'll give $10 million, then you give $100 million, meaning a private company must invest that. Now, of course, they have announced, for example, a $2 billion solar project in Angola, a $600 million for a US company to build a submarine cable from France to Singapore, 3.3 million, technical assistance to the Institute Pasteur to develop industrial scale multi-vaccine manufacturing. Now, you may recall that when the Quad had come into the picture, India got the advantage that we were asked to manufacture the vaccine, which was funded by the Japanese, and it was an American vaccine. So this is the kind of partnership which India is hoping we can get through this, that where funds, technology, which are scarce in India. We lack funds and technology. We have talent which we can deploy in India and thereafter scale it up.
Okay.
So that's the way it has to go.
Okay. Professor Baba, do you agree with what Mr. Joshi is referring to in terms of what we bring to the table and what we require as well to be meaningful partners in this journey?
Yeah, I think what Manoj is trying to also tell us is that, ultimately when you're looking at the planet, you have to look at it in totality. You'll have to look where technology is there, where challenges are there, and how do you bring technology, capital, and people together and to bring the benefits of all of that to a much larger population, right? So, I mean, if, for example, if Africa is not inoculated with the vaccine now in the pandemic, it doesn't mean the pandemic is not going to go away. So it's about how do you make use of these kind of, mini multilateral platforms to engage and create opportunities for other places. And I think that's where the Prime Minister's pitch to the G7 to invest in research, innovation, and manufacturing in India was also part of this larger pitch that come here with the technology, invest here in India. The returns, what you will get over here, are going to be long-term and sustaining. It will also fit in with what you're talking about, this ideational fit of all the democracies together. So you'll have to really take a pitch in the sense of like you are if you're engaging your business only with China and then you're calling us to stand up on other set of issues, then you need to also engage us where we also need to be moving forward. Okay. So I think one has to see it in that kind of the partnership, which will bring some kind of a win-win solution to both sides.
Okay. Ambassador Singh, do you agree? Equal partnership on the equal footing here. Of course, not everybody will have all aspects. India has expertise in certain aspects. It has talent, and on the food security aspect, like the Prime Minister said, that Indian farmers in agriculture sector, their talent can be utilized by the G7 countries.
Yes, I think Prime Minister very gently nudged the G7 towards some of India's typical issues which have not found clarity yet. On this, there were two. So this thing about Indian farmers, basically this was a pitch for labor mobility, which we have been asking for very long. And he also spoke about fertilizer, meaning that you are asking us to provide food grains from our stocks as part of a supply chain, but there is also a requirement for a fertilizer supply chain, which you can't forget, or an energy supply chain. So I think he gently brought those points home. And I think this we need to understand, because the variation between what the G7 says at their summit and what they do, let us say, at the WTO ministerial is totally varied. They talk about COVID vaccine for everybody, but they will not agree to a TRIPS waiver so India and South Africa can produce them for Africa. They will talk about a food grain supply chain, but they will not agree to public financing or public security of food grain under the WTO. So there is a dichotomy between their intention and the reality. Okay. That is what you see in the real terms, the national interest of G7 countries standing up.
Okay. So the intention will have to match with the realistic situation. Mr. Joshi, do you agree with this aspect here that, the G7 member nations will have to walk the talk? They can't just keep on announcing projects after the projects, but also ensure that those who are invited as being part of this process should get equal opportunities.
Well, that is certainly there. But, G7 is their forum. It's not our forum. We went there as guests. Okay, and the G7 itself, and I'm sure Ambassador Gurjeet will bear with me on this, that G7 has gone through phases when it has become fairly irrelevant. And right now, why we are seeing this G7 suddenly come back to life, there are two reasons. One is, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war and the securitization that Ambassador Gurjeet Singh spoke about. Mm-hmm. The second is, of course, the rise of China. So the G7 has suddenly reached out to various countries because otherwise the G7 was quite content in pursuing its own ends, doing whatever it wanted for rich nations. So I think the G7 itself has become sensitized now to this, but you never know for how long. Meaning if things continue in a certain way, the G7 could be back to its old ways. Mm-hmm. So the relevance of G7 itself periodically has been under a question mark. And that is why the G20 came up. Mm-hmm.
Okay, okay. Now that you mentioned G20 as well, Professor Baba, I'll ask you the final question for this discussion. And of course, vis-a-vis how G7 should treat the other nations which are willing to go ahead and become the partners in the journey. But also, interesting aspect here is that India is going to host the next G20, and that's going to happen soon. So another opportunity for us to go ahead and, put our case front for the other nations as well.
I think absolutely right. I think when you look at the G7, it's a limited members club. And as Manoj correctly pointed out, I mean, they can invite whom they want to showcase what kind of partnership they're building. But the G20 seeks to address that kind of anomaly which existed, especially in the backdrop of, the global financial crisis, recognizing that, there are other countries which are also important actors and players when you're looking about what will transform and how you bring about structural changes. So I think India, in that sense, if you look at it, in earlier years, seen as the leader of the global South, now transcending and going into the upper echelons of the global economy, Indian economy now at sixth position in GDP terms. So clearly, there's a big shift in the way as the Indian economy is perceived. Still, a lot more work needs to be done. But I think that's what, I think India's voice carries weight because it is both part of that opportunity which has opened up, and it is seeing already a success of that, and still part of that where we are still finishing up our SDGs, looking at bringing about development, sustainable, holistic for all the people. So it's easier to see why the G20 will resonate more and will be seen as, bringing far more dramatic changes. But in the backdrop of the current geopolitical situation, anything like the G7 format is bound to catch a lot of headlines, but as I said, behind the photo optics, how much of it actually transforms into reality and how much of it actually delivers on the ground, I think that is where the important work lies. So there is a world between the G7 and the G20. And India stands at a very important doorway between both.
And indeed, that's a wonderful way of putting it, that there is a world between G7 and G20. Quick concluding comments from you, Ambassador Singh, on this movement from G7 to G20, and that's going to be really important because we are the host this time around.
Well, we are the host in 2023, and I think we hope that this Russia-Ukraine war has settled down so we can go back to a normal agenda. But I fully agree with Professor Baba that yes, there is a world, but there is also BRICS. So if you see the 5 countries who were invited as guests to the G7, 2 of them are BRICS members and 2 want to be BRICS members. And 4 of them are in the G20. So I think the world is looking bridged, and G7 is on one corner. It is not center stage anymore. I think that is the role India needs to push for itself. Be center stage as a bridge and get the BRICS, get the G7, get the G20, all to do things rather than keep talking about.
Okay, there it is. Thank you so much, Mr. Gurjeet Singh, Mr. Manoj Joshi, and Professor Baba as well for sharing your views and input. As our experts were pointing out, all about the recent G7 summit, the key takeaways, what was said there, and what exactly is likely to transpire in the weeks and months to come, and about the importance, relevance, and significance of the G7, the platform itself. We'll come back again with a lot more in terms of topics and their analysis. Till then, keep watching Sunset Television. Thank you.